30 years of digging graves in Millfield Cemetery taught me that the dead are supposed to stay buried. But lately, I've been finding coffins that contain the wrong people. Last Tuesday, I opened a casket from 1987 to make room for a double burial and found a woman who looked exactly like the missing hitchhiker from the news, even though she disappeared just last week. The thing that keeps me awake at night isn't that dead people are somehow switching places in their graves. It's that some of the bodies I uncover aren't dead at all. They blink when the sunlight hits their faces, try to sit up when I disturb their rest, and whisper things like, "Thank you for finding me," before crumbling into dust that smells like prairie grass and forgotten years. My name is Lucas Hartwell, and I've been the head groundskeeper at Millfield Cemetery since 1994. Most folks in Broken Bow think I'm just the guy who digs holes and maintains the headstones, but that's only part of what I do. The real work, the work that pays me enough to keep my farmhouse on County Road 21, involves following a very specific set of protocols that old Heinrich Zimmerman handed down to me when I took over his position. Heinrich had worked these grounds since 1952, back when Millfield was just a small patch of consecrated earth behind St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. Before he retired to Florida, he sat me down in his cluttered office inside the maintenance shed and explained the rules. At first, I thought he was just an old German immigrant trying to scare the new guy, but after 30 years of following his protocols to the letter, I know better. Last night, I woke up screaming from the same dream I've been having for 3 weeks now. In the dream, I'm standing at the edge of Section C, the oldest part of the cemetery, where the headstones date back to the 1890s. The ground beneath my feet starts to shift and bubble, like someone stirring thick soup from underneath. Then the graves begin opening themselves, not violently, but slowly, methodically, like flowers blooming in reverse. What emerges aren't the people who were buried there. Instead, it's always the same group. 5 strangers I've never seen before, all wearing clothes from different time periods. They climb out of the wrong graves, brush the soil from their shoulders, and walk toward the cemetery gates. The woman in the 1950s dress always turns back to look at me before they disappear into the cornfields beyond Millfield Road. When I wake up, my pillow is always damp with sweat that smells like fresh-turned earth. This morning, I found muddy footprints leading from Section C to my back porch. The prints matched the shoes I saw in my dream. 5 different sets, including a pair of women's pumps that haven't been manufactured since Eisenhower was president. That's when I decided it was time to write this all down, because something tells me Heinrich's protocols aren't working like they used to. Maybe someone else needs to know what happens in rural cemeteries when the living and the dead start trading places. The first rule Heinrich taught me was simple: never dig after sunset. The earth changes when darkness falls, he'd said in his thick accent, tapping his gnarled finger against the maintenance shed's wooden table. What you bury in daylight stays buried. What you disturb at night, well, that's when things get mixed up. I thought he meant the practical stuff. Poor visibility, safety hazards, that kind of thing. After all, operating a backhoe in the dark seemed like a recipe for disaster. But on my 3rd week at Millfield, I learned what he really meant. It was October 1994, and Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski had passed away from complications after her hip surgery. Her funeral was scheduled for Friday morning, which meant I needed her grave ready by Thursday evening. The backhoe had been acting up all week, something about the hydraulic fluid needing replacement. So I'd been digging by hand with my trusty shovel and pickaxe. By Thursday afternoon, I was only halfway done. The October sun was already sinking behind the corn stalks that bordered the cemetery's western edge, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. I figured I had maybe 30 minutes of decent light left. But Eleanor's plot was in the newer section where the soil was easier to work with. I could finish before full dark if I hurried. That's when I made my first mistake. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared behind the tree line. My breath started forming little puffs in the air, and the sweat on my back turned cold and clammy. I kept digging, telling myself I was almost done, just another foot or two to regulation depth. Then my shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. It wasn't the solid thunk you get when you strike a rock, or the scraping sound of metal on metal. This was more like tapping on hollow wood. Old dry wood that had been underground for decades. I knelt down and brushed away the loose soil with my hands. Sure enough, there was a coffin lid about 3 feet down, exactly where Eleanor Kowalski was supposed to be buried the next morning. But according to the cemetery records I'd checked that afternoon, this section had been empty farmland until 1976. The nameplate on the coffin was tarnished brass, green with age. I had to use my flashlight to read it. Jacob Reeves, 1923 to 1945, beloved son. The dates made sense for someone buried here in the 1940s, but the location was all wrong. Jacob should have been in Section C with the other war veterans. I stood up and checked my measurements again, using the survey stakes I'd planted that morning. No mistake. I was digging in the right spot for Eleanor's grave. But somehow Jacob Reeves had gotten there first. Heinrich had mentioned something about this during my training. Sometimes the old ones migrate, he'd said. Usually happens when someone breaks the rules. The earth gets confused about what belongs where. I was about to fill the hole back in and start fresh in the morning when I heard tapping from below. 3 slow knocks, like someone politely asking to be let out. The sound came from inside Jacob's coffin. My hands started shaking as I knelt back down and pressed my ear to the wooden lid. Nothing at first, then 3 more knocks, slightly louder this time. Then a voice, muffled but clear. "Lucas? Sent you up there?" Nobody had called me by name. Nobody living anyway. "I've been waiting for you," the voice continued. It sounded young, maybe 20 or 25, with a slight Nebraska drawl. "Heinrich said you'd come eventually. Said you'd understand the rules better than most." "Heinrich?" I whispered back, feeling foolish for talking to a coffin. If you like the stories, please hype the videos from a button like this just above the comment section. It helps the videos to get more reach and perform well. It would take just a few seconds and cost nothing, but would help the channel grow even faster. Thank you. He visits sometimes, tells us about the new groundskeeper who's learning the old ways, says you follow the protocols better than anyone since old Frederick back in the 30s. I didn't know who Frederick was, but Heinrich had never mentioned visiting the cemetery after his retirement. Hell, he'd moved to Sarasota 3 months ago. "What do you want?" I asked. "Just wanted to thank you for keeping us organized. Things were getting messy before you took over. People ending up in the wrong decades, families separated by centuries. But you've been following the rules, and that helps us stay where we belong." The tapping stopped. I waited for several minutes, but Jacob Reeves had apparently said his piece. I filled the hole that night using my truck's headlights, working by the yellow glow of the high beams. The next morning, I dug Eleanor's grave 6 feet to the east, in soil that had definitely never held a coffin before. The funeral went off without a problem. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Jacob had said. People ending up in the wrong decades. Families separated by centuries. That's when I started paying closer attention to Heinrich's other rules. The second rule was about the maintenance shed. Always lock it before leaving, even if you're just stepping out for 5 minutes. Heinrich had been very specific about this one. The tools know their purpose, he'd explained, but sometimes they get ideas about working on their own. I'd been following that rule religiously for months, but I didn't understand it until the morning I found fresh grave dirt under my fingernails and couldn't remember digging anything the night before. It was a Tuesday in March 1995, about 6 months after the Jacob Reeves incident. Spring was coming early that year, and the frost was already breaking up in the cemetery's older sections. I'd spent the previous afternoon repairing winter damage to some headstones in Section B, using my hammer and chisel to clean up where the freeze-thaw cycle had cracked the limestone. That evening, I'd locked up the shed like always, checked the padlock twice, and drove home to my farmhouse on County Road 21. I'd made myself a dinner of leftover pot roast and mashed potatoes, watched the local news, and gone to bed around 10:30. Nothing unusual about any of it, but I woke up at dawn with dirt caked under my nails and the taste of earth in my mouth. The clothes I'd worn the day before were hanging in my closet, clean as when I'd put them away. My work boots sat by the front door, recently polished. There was no mud on the kitchen floor. No sign had been outside during the night. But my hands told a different story. Dark soil wedged deep under each fingernail, the kind that only comes from serious digging. I drove to Millfield Cemetery earlier than usual that morning, arriving just as the sun was painting the headstones gold. Everything looked normal at first glance. The maintenance shed was locked, exactly as I'd left it. My backhoe sat in its usual spot near the equipment garage. The newer graves were undisturbed, their sods still neat and trimmed. Then I walked into Section C, the oldest part of the cemetery where the Civil War veterans and pioneer families were buried. 3 graves had been opened during the night. Not vandalized or carelessly disturbed, but professionally excavated. Precise rectangular holes dug to exactly 6 feet deep, with the displaced soil neatly piled beside each opening. Someone had used proper technique, the kind that takes years to master. The strangest part was that all 3 graves were empty. Not just empty of bodies, but completely clean, as if they'd never held coffins at all. The walls were smooth and straight, the corners perfectly squared. Whoever had dug these graves knew what they were doing. I checked the headstones. Martha Pedersen, 1834 to 1889. Thomas Novak, 1841 to 1901. Little Sarah Bauer, 1887 to 1891. All 3 had been buried here for over a century, according to the cemetery records. Their plots were marked clearly in Heinrich's old ledger books, with detailed notes about casket materials and burial clothing. But now they were gone. I spent that morning filling the holes back in, working faster than I'd ever worked before. Something told me these graves needed to be sealed again before anyone else saw them. As I shoveled the last load of dirt onto Martha Pedersen's plot, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The soil was still warm, not sun-warmed. It was barely 8 in the morning and the day was cool. This was heat from deep underground, like the earth itself had a fever. When I pressed my palm to the freshly filled grave, it felt like touching the hood of a car that had been running all night. That afternoon, I drove to the Broken Bow Library and spent 3 hours researching those names in the old newspaper archives. What I found made me wish I'd never looked. Martha Pedersen had been the wife of a homesteader who'd claimed land near what's now Highway 2. According to the Custer County Chronicle from 1889, she died under mysterious circumstances, found in her farmhouse cellar with no signs of injury or illness. The article mentioned that several neighbors had reported seeing lights moving around the Pedersen property for weeks after her burial. Thomas Novak had been a railroad worker who disappeared while laying track for the Burlington Line in 1901. His body was never found, but the family held a funeral anyway, burying an empty casket. The newspaper account noted that fellow workers claimed to see Thomas walking the rail line at night for months afterward. Little Sarah Bauer was the most troubling case. She died of scarlet fever at age 4, but her grave had been disturbed multiple times over the years. Each time, local authorities had found the coffin empty. The family kept reburying empty caskets, hoping Sarah would find her way home eventually. 3 people who'd already proven they didn't stay buried, and now someone, or something, had dug them up again. I was putting the newspaper microfilm away when Mrs. Dorothy Larson approached my table. She'd been the head librarian for 40 years and knew everyone in Custer County by name. "Looking into the old cemetery records, Lucas?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone librarians use when they know more than they're saying. "Just doing some research for the Historical Society," I lied. She nodded, but her eyes stayed serious. "My grandmother used to tell stories about Millfield Cemetery. Said the ground there was special. Not blessed exactly, but active. The Pawnee used to camp near that spot before the settlers came. Called it a place where the living when dead could meet." Meet? Trade places, according to the old stories. Someone dies, but they're not ready to go. Someone living gets tired of the world, wants to rest. The earth helps them swap positions. She paused, studying my face. Of course, that's just folklore, nothing scientific about it. But her expression suggested she believed every word. That evening, I drove past Millfield Cemetery on my way home and noticed something that made me pull over. Fresh tire tracks led from the main road to the maintenance shed, tracks that hadn't been there that morning. Someone had visited while I was at the library. The shed was still locked, but when I checked the ground around it, I found footprints in the soft soil. 5 different sets, just like in my recurring dream, including a pair of women's pumps that looked like they hadn't walked on Earth since the Eisenhower administration. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee and Heinrich's old notebook, reading his rules by lamplight. There were 7 protocols total, written in his careful German script. I'd been following the first 2 without really understanding them. But as I read the others, I started to realize that Heinrich hadn't just been the groundskeeper. He'd been a guardian, keeping something contained that was much older and more dangerous than I'd imagined. The 3rd rule was written in Heinrich's notebook, with darker ink, as if he'd pressed harder while writing it. Never disturb a grave that has fresh flowers, even if the burial was decades ago. Fresh flowers means someone is still visiting. Someone who might not appreciate interruptions. I discovered what that meant 3 days after finding the empty graves in Section C. Thursday morning brought the kind of spring rain that turns cemetery grounds into a muddy mess. I was driving my pickup through the main gate when I spotted them. A bouquet of yellow daisies placed on Margaret Fisher's headstone. The flowers were bright and healthy, petals still holding droplets from the morning drizzle. Margaret Fisher had been buried in 1967. Her husband died in 1983. Her only son moved to California in the 80s. According to my records, nobody had visited her grave in over 5 years. But there they were. Fresh daisies arranged in a neat bundle, tied with a blue ribbon that looked like it had come from Brennan's flower shop on Main Street. I would have asked old Pete Brennan about it, but he'd been dead for 3 years. I left the flowers alone and went about my regular maintenance work. The rain had loosened some soil around the newer headstones, and I needed to tamp it back down before Sunday services. Standard groundskeeper stuff that kept my hands busy while my mind worked on the bigger problem. Around noon, I was replacing a fallen American flag on a veteran's grave when I noticed movement near Margaret Fisher's plot. A woman in a pale blue dress was kneeling beside the headstone, her gray hair pinned up in the style women wore back in the 50s. She appeared to be talking to the grave, though I couldn't make out the words from my position near the equipment shed. I'd never seen her before, which was unusual in a county where everybody knew everybody else's business. Broken Bow wasn't the kind of place where strangers showed up to tend graves without someone mentioning it at Marge's Cafe or the post office. I walked closer, pretending to check on nearby plots. The woman looked to be in her 70s, with the kind of posture that spoke of decades spent working farm chores. Her dress was well maintained but clearly vintage. Not costume vintage, but the real thing, carefully preserved and still worn. "Beautiful flowers," I said when I got close enough for conversation. She looked up at me with eyes that were startlingly blue, almost luminous in the gray light of the overcast day. "Margaret always loved daisies. I bring them every week, just like I promised." "That's very thoughtful. Are you family?" "Oh no, nothing like that." She stood up, brushing grass from her dress. "I'm Dorothy Larson. Margaret and I were neighbors growing up. Made a pact when we were girls that whoever went first, the other would keep bringing flowers until..." She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Until we were both ready to rest." The name Dorothy Larson was familiar. Very familiar. I'd spoken to Dorothy Larson just 3 days ago at the library. But that Dorothy had been maybe 40 years old, dark-haired, with a completely different face. "I'm Lucas, the groundskeeper here," I said carefully. "I know who you are." Her smile was warm, but somehow distant. "Heinrich spoke of you often. Said you were learning the old ways better than anyone expected." "You knew Heinrich?" We all knew Heinrich. He was very good at keeping things balanced. She glanced back at Margaret's headstone. "But balance is fragile, Lucas. When the rules get broken, people end up where they don't belong." A gust of wind caught her dress, and for just a moment, she seemed translucent, like I was looking at her through frosted glass. Then the wind died down, and she was solid again. "Dorothy," I said, "when exactly did you die?" She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Oh, I haven't died yet." "That's the problem." She picked up the empty water jar that had held the daisies. "I was supposed to pass last winter. Heart attack, very peaceful. But when my time came, I found someone else in my place. Someone who wanted to rest, but couldn't find her way." "Margaret?" "Margaret's been waiting in my farmhouse since December, taking care of my cats, watching my shows, living my life while I tend to her responsibilities here. It was meant to be temporary, just until we could sort things out properly." Her expression grew troubled. "But the sorting mechanism isn't working like it used to. Too many people in the wrong places, too much confusion in the ground itself." I thought about the 3 empty graves I'd filled in earlier that week. Heinrich's rules were supposed to prevent that kind of mixing up. Heinrich understood that Millfield sits on what my people called a crossing place, where the boundary between worlds gets thin. The Pawnee knew how to work with it, keep things orderly. The German settlers learned some of their methods, passed them down through the families who tended this ground. "Your people?" "My great-grandmother was Pawnee. Married a homesteader named Larson back in 1889. She taught her children the old ways of managing places like this, and they taught their children." Dorothy looked directly at me. "The library where you met the other Dorothy?" "That's my great-granddaughter. She's been helping maintain the balance from her side while I handle things from mine. Multiple generations of the same family, some living and some dead, working together to manage the cemetery's..." "What?" "Supernatural properties." So you're telling me there are two Dorothy Larsons? One alive and one dead. Neither of us is entirely alive or entirely dead right now. That's the point. She started walking toward the cemetery's main road. We're both stuck in between until the balance gets restored. Margaret can't pass on while she's living my life, and I can't rest while her grave needs tending. I followed her, my boots squelching in the muddy grass. How do we fix it? By following the rules Heinrich left you. All of them, not just the first few. She stopped beside a blue pickup truck that looked exactly like mine, down to the rust spot on the tailgate and the Broken Bow High School decal in the rear window. "That's my truck," I said. "No, this is Margaret's truck. She's been driving it while she lives at my farmhouse. Your truck is parked at the maintenance shed, where you left it this morning." Dorothy opened the driver's side door. "The problem, Lucas, is that when people end up in the wrong lives, they take their possessions with them. Creates echoes, duplicates, all sorts of confusion." She was right. I could see my actual truck near the shed, exactly where I'd parked it. But here was an identical vehicle that somehow belonged to a woman who'd been dead since 1967, but was currently living in a farmhouse that belonged to someone who should have died last winter. "Heinrich's fourth rule addresses this," Dorothy said, climbing into the truck. "Never assume you know which version of something is real. In a crossing place, reality has layers. What you see depends on which layer you're looking at." She started the engine, which sounded exactly like my truck's engine, including the slight knock that meant I needed to change the oil soon. "The other Dorothy will be expecting you at the library tomorrow. Bring Heinrich's notebook. She'll show you the rest of what you need to know." Dorothy put the truck in gear. "And Lucas, stop filling in those empty graves. They're empty for a reason. Some vacancies need to stay vacant until the right person is ready to occupy them." I watched her drive away in my truck that wasn't my truck, carrying flowers to a dead woman who was living in a farmhouse that belonged to someone else. That night, I finally understood why Heinrich had moved to Florida so suddenly after 30 years of faithful service. Some jobs are too complicated for one person to handle alone. The next morning, I drove to the Broken Bow Library with Heinrich's notebook tucked under my arm. The living Dorothy Larson was waiting for me at the same table where I'd researched the missing graves, surrounded by books about local history and Native American customs. She looked up when I approached, and I could see the family resemblance to the woman I'd met at the cemetery. The same bright blue eyes, just set in a younger face. "My great-grandmother visited you yesterday," she said without preamble. "She said you're ready to learn about the deeper protocols." I sat down across from her, placing Heinrich's notebook on the table. "Your great-grandmother has been dead for decades. Death is more flexible than most people realize, especially here." Dorothy opened one of her books to a page showing old photographs of Pawnee settlements. "This area has always been what anthropologists call a liminal space, a boundary between different states of existence. The tribe that camped here before a white settlement understood how to work with that property. They used it for vision quests, communication with ancestors, healing rituals that required interaction between the living and the dead." She pointed to a photograph of Native Americans gathered around what looked like a ceremonial site. The landscape in the background was unmistakably the area where Millfield Cemetery now stood. The same rolling hills, the same line of cottonwood trees along what would become Millfield Road. When the German settlers arrived in the 1880s, they chose this spot for their cemetery because the ground was already consecrated. They didn't understand the full implications, but they recognized something sacred about the place. Dorothy turned the page to show newspaper clippings from the early 1900s. "The problem started when they began burying people without following the traditional protocols. What kind of problems? Families finding the wrong bodies in their relatives' graves. People who'd been dead for years showing up at their old homes, confused about why strangers were living there. Children playing with friends who'd died decades before they were born. She pulled out a manila folder filled with handwritten reports. The community leaders tried to dismiss it as folklore, but by 1920, things had gotten so chaotic that they hired Frederick Steinberg to research solutions. I recognized the name from my conversation with Jacob Reeves. The groundskeeper from the 30s? Frederick was actually an anthropologist from the university in Lincoln. He spent 2 years interviewing the remaining Pawnee elders and documenting their methods for managing crossing places. That's where Heinrich's protocols came from, a synthesis of tribal wisdom and European funeral traditions. Dorothy opened Heinrich's notebook to a page I hadn't read carefully before. The fourth rule was written in English rather than German script. When the cemetery bell rings on its own, someone is trying to trade places. Count the chimes. Ring the bell that many times in return to grant permission, or ring once to deny the request. I've never heard the cemetery bell ring, I said. That's because you haven't been listening for it. The bell in St. Matthew's Bell Tower connects directly to the crossing mechanism. It's how the waiting souls communicate their requests. Dorothy traced her finger along Heinrich's careful handwriting. But you have to understand what you're agreeing to before you respond. She showed me another page, this one covered with names and dates in Heinrich's German script. Most of the entries were simple notes about burials and maintenance, but scattered throughout were longer passages that looked like case studies. Heinrich documented every trade that happened during his tenure, Dorothy explained. He learned to recognize the patterns, who was likely to want to swap places, which requests should be granted, how to manage the aftermath when things went wrong. I studied one of the longer entries, dated September 1963. According to Heinrich's notes, a farmer named William Patterson had requested to trade places with his infant son who'd died of pneumonia. Heinrich had granted the request, allowing the father to rest while the child continued growing up in William's body. The entry noted that young William had lived a full life in his father's place, eventually dying of old age in 1998. This is insane, I said. People can't just swap bodies with their dead relatives. They're not swapping bodies. They're swapping positions, I suppose you'd call them. The living person takes on the rest and peace of death, while the dead person gets to continue experiencing life. Dorothy flipped to another section of Heinrich's notes. It only works at crossing places, and only when both parties truly consent to the exchange. What about Margaret Fisher and your great-grandmother? That was supposed to be temporary. Margaret had unfinished business. She wanted to see how her old neighborhood had changed, visit places from her childhood one more time. Great-grandmother was tired and ready for peace. They agreed to trade for just a few weeks. Dorothy's expression grew troubled. But something's been interfering with the mechanism that allows them to trade back. The empty graves I found? That's part of it. When graves that should be occupied are left empty, it creates gaps in the system. Dead people who should be resting peacefully start wandering around, looking for their proper places. Living people who might normally never consider trading start feeling drawn to the idea of giving up their burdens. I thought about my recurring dream, the thought of strangers climbing out of the wrong graves. Heinrich wrote about keeping things organized. What happens if the organization breaks down completely? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, looking through more of the historical documents. Finally, she pulled out a photograph that made my stomach drop. It showed Millfield Cemetery in what looked like the 1940s, but something was terribly wrong with the scene. Every grave in the photograph was open. Dozens of rectangular holes stretched across the cemetery grounds, with displaced soil piled in neat mounds beside each opening. But there were people standing in the empty graves, men and women in clothing from different decades, all looking directly at the camera with expressions I couldn't quite read. This was taken in 1943, during what the records call the Great Confusion, Dorothy said. Frederick's replacement had gotten overwhelmed and stopped following the protocols. For 6 months, anyone who died in Custer County ended up in the wrong place, while people who'd been dead for decades started living again in borrowed bodies. How did they fix it? They didn't, exactly. The situation resolved itself when the crossing place became saturated. There were so many people in the wrong positions that the mechanism shut down entirely for several years. No trades, no exchanges, no communication between the living and the dead. She pointed to the figures standing in the empty graves. These people were trapped in limbo until things stabilized. And Heinrich prevented that from happening again? Heinrich maintained the balance for 40 years, but he's been gone for almost a year now, and you've been learning the protocols piecemeal without understanding the full system. Dorothy closed the notebook. The mechanism is starting to break down again. That's why you're having the dreams, why the empty graves appeared, why my great-grandmother is stuck tending flowers instead of resting peacefully. She stood up and gathered her books. Rule 5 is the most important one, Lucas. Heinrich wrote it on the last page of his notebook, in red ink. Have you read it yet? I flipped to the back of the notebook. There, in Heinrich's careful German script but translated into English below, was a single sentence that made everything else make sense. When the crossing place becomes unstable, the groundskeeper must choose: restore the balance through sacrifice, or let the confusion spread beyond the cemetery bounds. What kind of sacrifice? I asked. But Dorothy Larson had already walked away, leaving me alone with Heinrich's notebook and the growing realization that my job involved much more than just digging graves and maintaining headstones. Outside, the afternoon sky was darkening with storm clouds, and somewhere in the distance I could swear I heard the faint sound of a bell ringing. That evening, I heard the bell for the first time. I was in my kitchen, heating up a can of Campbell's soup and trying to make sense of Heinrich's notebook, when the sound drifted through my open window. At first, I thought it was coming from St. Matthew's. Maybe Pastor Anderson was testing the equipment for Sunday service. But the timing was wrong. 7 distinct chimes, slow and measured. Nothing like the cheerful call to worship that rang every Sunday morning. I counted them twice to be sure. 7 chimes, with exactly 3 seconds between each one. According to Heinrich's notes, 7 chimes meant someone had been dead for 7 decades and wanted to trade places with someone who'd been alive for an equal amount of time. I grabbed a flashlight and drove to the cemetery, arriving just as the last echoes faded across the cornfields. The cemetery felt different at night, not threatening exactly, but expectant, like a theater before the curtain rises. I walked directly to the bell tower beside St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The rope hung still and undisturbed, but when I touched it, the hemp felt warm against my palm. Someone was waiting near the newer section of the cemetery. A man in a dark wool coat, standing beside a headstone I couldn't read from my position. He looked to be in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of posture that comes from decades of farm work. When he saw my flashlight, he raised his hand in greeting. "You must be Lucas," he called. "Heinrich said you'd come when the bell rang." I approached cautiously, keeping the flashlight pointed at the ground between us. "And you are?" Robert Mueller. Been waiting here since 1953. He gestured to the headstone beside him. That's my plot, though I haven't been using it much lately. The headstone read, Robert Mueller, 1883 to 1953, beloved husband and father. Simple, no nonsense, the kind of marker a practical farmer would choose. You've been dead for over 40 years, I said, in a manner of speaking. But I've been watching over my farm, helping my great-grandson with the harvest, keeping an eye on things. He looked toward the lights of Broken Bow in the distance. Problem is, young Bobby is 70 now himself. Getting tired, wants to retire but can't bring himself to give up the land. Been in the family since 1889. So you want to trade places? Bobby deserves his rest. He's worked that farm his whole life, raised 5 children, built something worth passing down. And I am ready to sleep. Robert's smile was sad but peaceful. 7 decades is long enough to be a ghost in your own life. I pulled Heinrich's notebook from my jacket and checked the 4th rule again. Ring the bell the same number of times to grant permission, or ring once to deny the request. How do I know this is the right choice? I asked. You don't. That's why Heinrich got paid extra. Robert chuckled, but his expression remained serious. All I can tell you is what I told Heinrich when I first made this request, back in 1955. Some people are born to tend the living world, and others are meant to guard the spaces in between. Bobby belongs with the living. I belong here. I walked to the bell tower and grasped the rope. It felt heavier than it should have, as if the bronze bell above had accumulated weight from years of these midnight conversations. I pulled 7 times, counting each chime as it rolled across the cemetery grounds and faded into the Nebraska night. Robert Mueller smiled and began walking toward his headstone. With each step, he became more translucent, until he was just a shimmer in the darkness. By the time he reached his grave, he was gone entirely. The next morning, I read in the Custer County Chief that Bobby Mueller, 70, had passed away peacefully in his sleep. His obituary mentioned that he'd seemed unusually content in his final days, spending time organizing his affairs and ensuring his great-grandson would inherit the family farm with clear title and no debt. But that afternoon, I saw Bobby Mueller at the hardware store in Broken Bow. He looked exactly like his great-grandfather had at 40, strong, confident, ready for whatever work needed doing. When our eyes met across the store, he nodded once, the same gesture Robert had used in greeting. Heinrich's 5th rule suddenly made more sense. The groundskeeper's sacrifice wasn't necessarily death. It was accepting responsibility for decisions that would reshape entire families across generations. That night, I discovered Rules 6 and 7. Rule 6 was written in Heinrich's most careful script. If someone visits their own grave while they're still alive, they're testing whether the trade is possible. Do not acknowledge them directly, but note the time and date. They may request an exchange within 3 days. Rule 7 was the most complex. When multiple people want to trade into the same position, conduct the lottery at midnight on the new moon. Each participant drops a personal item into the empty grave. The item that sinks deepest wins the right to rest. I was still puzzling over the implications when I heard vehicles approaching the cemetery. 3 pickup trucks, driving without headlights, moving slowly down the gravel road that led to the newer section. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the sound, staying in the shadows of the older headstones. The trucks parked near Section D, where we'd buried most of the people who died in the last 20 years. 7 people got out, men and women ranging from middle-age to elderly, all carrying small objects in their hands. They walked purposefully toward an empty plot I recognized from the cemetery records. space reserved for Emma Kowalski, who was currently in the hospital with late-stage cancer, but hadn't died yet. I'd never seen any of these people before, but their movements suggested they'd done this before. They formed a circle around Emma's future gravesite and began placing their objects on the ground: a wedding ring, a pocket watch, a fountain pen, a small wooden cross, a pair of reading glasses, a ceramic thimble, and what looked like a military medal. The oldest woman in the group, maybe 80 years old, stepped forward and began speaking in a voice that carried clearly in the still night air. Emma Kowalski has lived 91 years. Cancer's taking her slowly, painfully. Doctor says she has maybe 2 weeks left. The woman looked around the circle at the other participants. We're all tired. Some of us have been tired for years. The question is, who deserves Emma's rest the most? I understood now. These weren't random people. They were potential traders, people who'd been attending these midnight lotteries for months or years, waiting for the right opportunity to exchange their lives for the peace of death. Marcus Jansen, 67, diabetes, kidney failure, 3 surgeries this year. The woman continued, pointing to a man leaning heavily on a walking stick. Dorothy Fleming, 74. Alzheimer's starting to take her memories. Doesn't want to forget her children's names. She gestured to a woman clutching the ceramic thimble. Robert Chin, 58. Lost his wife and son in the accident on Highway 2. Can't find a reason to keep going. The man with the military medal nodded when she said his name, and so on, around the circle. Each person carried burdens that had made life feel heavier than death. Heinrich used to oversee these lotteries, the elderly woman said, looking directly at me in my hiding place behind the headstones. But we haven't seen him in months. The sick and tired have been accumulating, Lucas. People who would have found peace are instead suffering, waiting for someone to manage the crossing mechanism. I stepped out of the shadows, knowing there was no point in pretending I hadn't seen everything. What happens if Emma doesn't die? Then we wait for the next opportunity. But the waiting is getting harder. The woman with the thimble spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. My mind is going, young man. Some mornings I don't remember my husband's face. If I wait much longer, there won't be enough of me left to make the trade worthwhile. And if I don't oversee the lottery, then they'll start trading without proper oversight. Desperate people make bad decisions, take exchanges that aren't fair or sustainable. The elderly woman picked up the pocket watch from the ground. Heinrich prevented that by ensuring every trade was properly matched, ethically sound, mutually beneficial. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. These weren't just supernatural transactions. They were mercy, allowing people to choose dignity over suffering, rest over exhaustion, peace over pain. But they were also irreversible. Once someone traded their life for death, there was no going back. I looked around the circle of hopeful faces, people who'd driven to a cemetery at midnight because they were ready to give up everything they'd ever known. I need time to study Heinrich's procedures, I said finally. Emma Kowalski doesn't have time, Marcus Jansen replied. Neither do we. The lottery was scheduled for tomorrow night, whether I participated or not. Emma Kowalski died at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning. The call came from her daughter Linda, asking if I could prepare the grave for a Saturday service. Emma's plot was already reserved in Section D, the same empty space where 7 desperate people had gathered for their midnight lottery. I spent that day reading everything Heinrich had written about conducting the selection process. His notes were detailed, but troubling. Case studies of previous lotteries where people had lied about their suffering, where families had been torn apart by trades, where the wrong person had won and lived to regret their choice. One entry from 1978 particularly bothered me. A lottery between 4 participants had been won by a man named Frank Peterson, who'd claimed to be dying of lung cancer. After the trade was completed, and Frank had taken the place of a deceased farmer's wife, Heinrich discovered that Frank had been lying. He was healthy but wanted to escape gambling debts. The farmer's wife, now trapped in Frank's life, had spent her remaining years paying off debts that weren't hers and avoiding loan sharks who thought she was Frank. Trust, but verify. Heinrich had written in red ink at the bottom of that entry. Desperation makes people creative with the truth. That evening, I drove to the cemetery early and hid my truck behind the maintenance shed. The 7 participants arrived separately this time, parking along different sections of Millfield Road and walking to Emma's grave from various directions. They'd learned to be careful about drawing attention to their gatherings. Margaret Booth was the oldest, the woman who'd organized the previous night's meeting. She arrived first, carrying a leather purse that looked like it had belonged to her mother. Next came Harold Jensen, a retired teacher whose hands shook with palsy as he placed his father's fountain pen beside the empty grave. Dorothy Fleming came third, moving slowly and stopping frequently to check a piece of paper in her hand. Directions she'd written to herself, because her memory could no longer be trusted. She carried the ceramic thimble, pressing it to her lips before setting it on the ground. The others followed. Robert Smith, with his military medal, Patricia Williams with her wedding ring, David Norton with his pocket watch, and Marcus Jansen with his reading glasses. Each person moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd already said goodbye to their old life. I waited until they'd all gathered around Emma's future resting place before stepping out of the shadows. Some of them looked surprised to see me. Others seemed relieved. "Before we begin," I said, "I need to ask each of you the same questions Heinrich asked. Not to judge, but to make sure you understand what you're choosing." Margaret Booth nodded. "That's fair." I started with her. "Margaret, tell me about your worst day in the last year." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Last Christmas. My daughter invited me to dinner, but I could see in her eyes that I was a burden. I couldn't remember her husband's name, couldn't follow the conversation, kept asking the same questions. I went home that night and sat in my empty house, knowing I was losing pieces of myself every day." "And your best day?" 3 weeks ago. I woke up and everything was clear. My memory, my thoughts, my connection to the world. I called my daughter and had a real conversation with her for the first time in months. We laughed together. She touched the ceramic thimble. But it only lasted until noon. Then the fog rolled back in. I asked similar questions of each participant, learning about their daily struggles, their moments of clarity, their reasons for wanting to trade their continuing existence for whatever peace Emma Kowalski would find in death. Harold Jensen's arthritis had gotten so severe that he couldn't hold a pen to grade papers or write letters to his grandchildren. Patricia Williams had been caring for her husband with dementia for 6 years, watching him forget her name more often than he remembered it. David Norton hadn't slept through the night since his wife died, spending his days in an empty house full of memories he couldn't escape. Each story was heartbreaking in its own way, but Heinrich's notes had taught me to look for inconsistencies, exaggerations, or signs that someone might be choosing death for the wrong reasons. "Robert," I said to the man with the military medal, "tell me about your son." His face crumpled. Jimmy was 22, just finished college, had a job lined up in Omaha. We were driving to his graduation when the semi ran the red light. He held up the medal. This was his grandfather's from Korea. Jimmy was going to carry it in his pocket during the ceremony. "When did the accident happen?" 8 months ago. Have you talked to anyone about your grief? A counselor? Your pastor?" Robert's expression hardened. "Grief counseling doesn't bring back your child, Lucas." "No, but it might help you find reasons to keep living." "I don't want reasons to keep living. I want to be with my son." That was the red flag Heinrich had warned about. Someone choosing death, not because their current life had become unbearable, but because they hoped death would reunite them with lost loved ones. "I'm sorry, Robert, but I can't include you in the lottery." The other participants shifted uncomfortably as Robert stared at me. "You don't understand what I'm going through." "I understand that you're in pain. But trading places with Emma won't take you to where Jimmy is. It'll just end your existence here while giving her a chance to continue in your body. You'll both be trapped. You in death that brings no reunion. Her in a life filled with your grief." Robert looked like he wanted to argue, but Margaret Booth placed a gentle hand on his arm. "He's right, honey. This isn't about joining the people we've lost. It's about finding peace when living has become harder than dying." Robert picked up his medal and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the cemetery gates. That left 6 participants for one opportunity. I pulled out Heinrich's copy of the lottery procedures and began the ritual he'd developed over 40 years of managing these exchanges. Each person stated their name, age, and primary reason for seeking rest. Then they placed their personal items in Emma's empty grave, 6 feet down in the rich Nebraska soil. The selection method was surprisingly simple. The items were allowed to settle naturally in the loose earth for exactly 5 minutes, timed by Heinrich's old pocket watch. The object that sank deepest in the soft ground would identify the winner. As we waited, Margaret Booth started crying quietly. "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if I'm wrong? What if there are still good days ahead that I'm giving up?" "There might be," I said honestly. "That's the risk everyone here is taking." "But what if the bad days outnumber the good ones by so much that the math just doesn't work anymore?" Harold Jensen reached over and took her hand with his shaking fingers. "Then we trust that Emma Kowalski lived long enough to know what peace feels like, and we hope she'll share that knowledge with whoever wins." When the 5 minutes were up, I climbed down into the grave with my flashlight. Margaret's leather purse had sunk about 8 inches into the soil. Harold's fountain pen had settled at roughly the same depth. Patricia's wedding ring had disappeared completely, lost in the soft earth. Dorothy Fleming's ceramic thimble sat on the surface, barely indented into the ground at all. But David Norton's pocket watch had sunk nearly 18 inches down, much deeper than the others. "David wins," I announced from the bottom of the grave. The others congratulated him with the mixture of relief and disappointment that comes when someone else gets something you desperately wanted but were afraid to receive. David Norton climbed down into the grave beside me. At 63, he'd been married to the same woman for 41 years, had raised 3 children, and worked as a mechanic until arthritis forced him into retirement. Since his wife's death from cancer 18 months earlier, he'd been living alone in their house, surrounded by 40 years of shared memories, and no idea how to build a future without her. "Are you sure about this?" I asked him. "I've been sure for 6 months," he replied. "I've seen the doctor, talked to my pastor, spent time with my children. I've tried everything people suggested for dealing with loneliness and grief. Nothing works. I'm ready to rest." I helped him out of the grave and walked him through the final steps of Heinrich's protocol. The actual exchange wouldn't happen until Emma Kowalski was buried on Saturday, but David needed to prepare by settling his affairs, saying goodbyes without explaining why, and spending his final days making peace with the life he was choosing to end. The other 5 participants gathered their belongings and left quietly, knowing they'd have to wait for the next opportunity. As I drove home that night, I wondered if Heinrich had felt this weight after every lottery. The knowledge that you'd just helped someone choose death over life, and the responsibility for ensuring their choice was honored properly. Emma Kowalski's funeral was scheduled for 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. I arrived at the cemetery before dawn to prepare everything according to Heinrich's protocols, but something was wrong from the moment I stepped out of my truck. The grave I dug for Emma 3 days earlier was already occupied, not by Emma's casket, which wouldn't arrive until noon, but by David Norton. He was sitting cross-legged at the bottom of the 6-foot hole, wearing his best suit and holding the pocket watch that had won him the lottery. His eyes were closed and he was breathing in the slow, measured pattern of someone deep in meditation. "David?" I called down to him. "What are you doing?" He opened his eyes and looked up at me with a calmness I hadn't seen in him during the lottery. Heinrich used to have people prepare this way, spend time in their new resting place before the exchange, get comfortable with the transition. Heinrich never wrote about that in his notes. Heinrich didn't write down everything he knew. Some lessons he only shared with people who were actually making the trade. David stood up and brushed dirt from his pants. "I've been here since midnight, talking with Emma. Emma's dead. She can't talk. Death doesn't work the way most people think, Lucas. Emma's been preparing for this exchange just like I have. She's ready to take on the burden of continuing, and I'm ready to let go of it." I helped David climb out of the grave, but something about his demeanor made me uneasy. He moved with a confidence that hadn't been there during the lottery, spoke with knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. "How do you know what Emma wants?" I asked. "Because she told me. We've been sharing dreams for the past 3 nights, getting to know each other, making sure we're compatible for the trade." David smiled, but there was something different about his expression, a serenity that looked almost foreign on his weathered face. "She lived a good life, Lucas. 91 years of love, family, community service, faith. But her body was failing, and the cancer was taking away everything that made life worth living. She's ready to pass those experiences to someone who can appreciate them properly. And you're ready to give up your memories of your wife. I'm ready to give up the pain of losing her. The good memories will become Emma's. She never had a marriage like mine, never knew what it felt like to love someone for 40 years. She deserves to experience that happiness, even secondhand." The exchange was supposed to happen during the burial, when Emma's casket was lowered into the ground and David made physical contact with the wooden surface. According to Heinrich's notes, the moment of transition would be brief and peaceful. David would simply stop breathing while Emma's consciousness took over his body. But as I watched David Norton standing beside his chosen grave, I realized Heinrich's protocols might be incomplete. The morning crawled by as I completed routine maintenance tasks and waited for the funeral party to arrive. Around 11:30, the hearse from Fletcher's funeral home pulled through the cemetery gates, followed by a modest procession of family cars. Emma Kowalski had outlived most of her generation, so the gathering was small, maybe 20 people, mostly middle-aged children and teenage grandchildren. Linda Kowalski, Emma's daughter, approached me while the funeral director was organizing the pallbearers. She was a sturdy woman in her 60s, with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd been managing her mother's affairs for years. "Mr. Hartwell, I wanted to thank you for taking such good care of the cemetery. Mother always said it was beautiful here, peaceful." She looked around at the well-maintained grounds, the neat rows of headstones, the carefully trimmed grass. She used to drive out here sometimes just to sit and think. Said it helped her feel connected to the people she'd lost. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," I said, hoping my voice sounded normal. "She was ready to go, you know. The last few weeks, she kept talking about being tired, about wanting to rest. I think she'd made peace with dying." Linda paused, studying my face. She also kept mentioning dreams about a man who wanted to trade places with her. Strange dreams, very vivid. The doctors said it was the morphine, but Mother insisted they felt real. My stomach dropped. If Emma had been talking about the dreams, other people might know about the exchange system. "Dreams can be very powerful when someone's near death," I said carefully. Mother said the man in her dreams had lost his wife and couldn't find his way back to happiness. She wanted to help him, give him a chance to experience the kind of love she'd known with our father. Linda's eyes filled with tears. Even dying, she was still trying to take care of other people. The funeral service was simple and dignified. Pastor Anderson spoke about Emma's long life, her dedication to her family and community, her faith in God's plan. The grandchildren shared memories of her cooking, her garden, her habit of sending birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside. Throughout the service, David Norton sat in the back row, listening intently to every story about Emma's life. He took notes in a small notebook, as if he was studying for an exam he couldn't afford to fail. When it came time for the burial, the pallbearers carried Emma's casket to the graveside with careful reverence. The funeral director positioned it over the opening I'd prepared, then activated the lowering device that would settle the casket into the earth. According to Heinrich's protocol, David needed to touch the casket as it descended and silently request the exchange. The transfer would happen during the pastor's final blessing, while everyone else had their heads bowed. But as the casket began its descent, something went wrong. David Norton collapsed, not gracefully, not peacefully, but violently, convulsing on the ground beside the grave, his eyes rolled back, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. The funeral guests stepped back in alarm while I knelt beside him, trying to figure out what was happening. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted. "Is he having a seizure? Does anyone know CPR?" But even as people rushed to help, I could see that David wasn't dying. He was changing. His face was smoothing out, the deep lines of grief and loneliness fading. His gray hair was darkening. His hands, which had been gnarled with arthritis, were becoming supple and strong. And from inside the casket, I heard Emma Kowalski's voice. "Thank you, David. I'll take good care of your memories." The transformation lasted maybe 30 seconds. When it was over, the person lying on the ground looked like David Norton, but moved like Emma Kowalski. Careful, thoughtful, curious about the world. She sat up slowly, accepting help from the funeral guests, who didn't realize they were now talking to a 91-year-old consciousness in a 63-year-old body. "I'm fine," she said in David's voice, but with Emma's speech patterns. "Just felt dizzy for a moment. The heat, you know." Pastor Anderson resumed the burial service, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching Emma in David's body as she experienced her first few minutes in a healthy, pain-free form. She flexed her fingers, testing joints that no longer ached. She took deep breaths, filling lungs that weren't congested with fluid. She smiled with genuine joy at sensations she hadn't felt in years. After the service ended and the mourners dispersed, Emma approached me at the graveside. "The trade worked perfectly," she said, though hearing her voice come from David's mouth was deeply unsettling. "David is resting peacefully, and I have decades of life ahead to experience with his memories as my guide. What happens now?" Now I go back to David's house and learn how to live his life. I have his memories of his wife, his children, his daily routines. It'll be like putting on clothes that belong to someone else. They might not fit perfectly at first, but I'll grow into them. She looked down at the fresh soil covering her old body's grave. And David gets the peace he was looking for, plus the satisfaction of knowing his life is continuing in good hands. That night, I sat on my front porch and counted the empty graves Heinrich had left me to manage. 7 protocols, hundreds of potential trades, and the growing realization that I'd become something far more complex than a groundskeeper. I'd become the guardian of a place where death was negotiable, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough for the responsibility. I'm writing this on a Tuesday evening in my kitchen, the same place where I first heard the cemetery bell ring. Heinrich's notebook lies open beside my coffee cup, filled now with my own entries documenting the trades, the lotteries, the careful balance between life and death that defines my work at Millfield Cemetery. Emma Kowalski, living now in David Norton's body, stopped by yesterday afternoon. She's adapted remarkably well to her new circumstances, though she still moves with the careful deliberation of someone who's spent decades in an aging frame. She brought cookies, chocolate chip made from David's wife's recipe, which she'd found in a handwritten cookbook tucked away in his kitchen cabinet. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, settling into the chair across from my kitchen table. "David's memories of his marriage are beautiful. I understand now why he couldn't bear living without her, but also why those 40 years of love were worth preserving. She's become something I hadn't expected, a success story. The trade gave David the peace he desperately needed, while allowing Emma to experience the deep, lasting love she'd never found in her own 91 years. Both parties got exactly what they were looking for. Not every exchange works out so well. Last week I had to deny a lottery request from a group of terminally ill patients who wanted to trade places with accident victims. Heinrich's notes were clear about this situation. Traumatic deaths create unstable transitions, consciousness that hasn't had time to prepare for the exchange. The risk of psychological damage to both parties was too high. The bell rings more frequently now. Word has spread through the careful networks that connect the desperate. Whispered conversations in hospital waiting rooms, hushed discussions at senior centers, the quiet circulation of stories about a cemetery in rural Nebraska where death is just another transaction. I've learned to recognize the patterns Heinrich documented. The 7 chime requests usually come from people who've been waiting decades for the right opportunity. Single chimes are often impulsive decisions that need to be refused. The complex rhythms, groups of chimes separated by silence, indicate family members trying to coordinate multiple trades, which requires weeks of careful evaluation. Dorothy Larson visits regularly, both the living librarian and her deceased great-grandmother. They've become my advisors, helping me understand the cultural and historical context for requests that go beyond simple life-for-death exchanges. Some people want to trade not just their existence, but their memories, their relationships, their accumulated experiences. I've started training an apprentice, a young woman named Beth Novak, whose family has lived in Custer County for 4 generations. She has the sensitivity needed for this work. She can hear the cemetery bell from her apartment in town, feels the pull of the crossing place even when she's not on the grounds. Heinrich had trained his replacement the same way, gradually introducing the protocols until the full responsibility could be transferred. Because someday I'll be tired enough to want my own trade. The thought doesn't frighten me anymore. I understand now that Heinrich's move to Florida wasn't retirement. It was preparation. He'd spent 40 years managing the boundary between life and death, helping hundreds of people find the peace they couldn't achieve on their own. When his time came, he'd earned the right to choose his own terms for letting go. I've been the groundskeeper at Millfield Cemetery for 30 years, but I've been the guardian of the crossing place for less than 2. The weight of that responsibility grows heavier with each decision I make, each trade I oversee, each desperate person I turn away, because their reasons aren't sound enough to justify the exchange. But I've also seen the good that comes from giving people control over their final transition. Death doesn't have to be something that happens to you. It can be something you choose, on your terms, with dignity and purpose. The bell is ringing again. Someone needs help crossing over. Time to get back to work.